Most Americans picture the Vietnam War as moments of chaos, gunfire, explosions, ambushes, short bursts of terror followed by silence. What Vietnam actually did to you? Soldiers was quieter than that and far more relentless. For many of them, the most exhausting enemy was not the one firing back, it was the jungle itself. The jungle did not announce when it was dangerous. It did not separate safety from threat. It never allowed the body or the mind to fully relax. From the moment a soldier stepped off a helicopter and into the trees, something fundamental changed. The air felt heavier, not just hot but thick and wet, pressing against the skin. Sweat began almost immediately, soaking uniforms before the first step was taken. It never dried, it just stayed there, clinging, mixing with dirt, insect repellent, and the sharp metallic smell of weapons. The jungle swallowed sound in strange ways. Bird calls echoed too close. Insects buzzed so constantly that silence itself became suspicious. A snapped twig could mean nothing or everything. The brain learned quickly that every noise demanded attention, every shadow needed to be watched. And the worst part was that nothing ever confirmed whether fear was justified. American soldiers were trained for battles, for clear moments of action. But the jungle offered no clear edges, no front line, no safe rear. Danger did not arrive, it simply existed everywhere at once. Days blurred together. Patrols moved slowly, deliberately, cutting through foliage that fought back at every step. Vines caught on equipment, branches scraped skin, leeches crawled unnoticed until blood appeared inside boots. Every movement required effort, every pause carried tension. Stopping did not mean resting. When soldiers halted, they listened, they scanned, they waited. Waiting became its own form of punishment. The body wanted to sit, to lean against a tree, to unclench, but leaning meant exposure, sitting meant vulnerability. Trees were not shelter, they were hiding places for someone else. Sleep was never deep. Sleep was negotiated. At night, the jungle changed character. Sounds grew louder, closer. Insects hit skin like rain. The darkness felt solid, as if it could be touched. Soldiers slept in fragments, waking at every unfamiliar noise, fingers already tightening around rifles before consciousness fully returned. Some later said they never truly slept in Vietnam. They only shut their eyes. The brain, deprived of rest, began to misfire. Shapes moved that weren't there. Sounds seemed to repeat. Time stretched and collapsed in strange ways. Minutes felt endless, weeks vanished. Fear did not spike. It simmered. And that was the problem. A soldier could handle a firefight. There was clarity in it, direction, purpose. When bullets flew, the body knew what to do. Adrenaline surged, training took over, and afterward, if you survived, there was a release. The jungle offered no release. Even when nothing happened, something felt wrong. Too quiet, too normal, too still. Soldiers learned that the calmest moments were often the most dangerous. That stillness could be deliberate. Every patrol carried the same unspoken question: is this the moment? The answer never came until it was too late, or not at all. Humidity blurred vision. Sweat ran into eyes, stinging, impossible to wipe away without lifting a hand from a weapon. The smell of rot hung constantly in the air. Decaying leaves, mud, something older, deeper. The scent of a place that reclaimed everything, eventually. Men began to feel small inside it. The jungle did not care how long you had been there. It did not respond to experience. Veterans did not feel safer than new arrivals. In some ways, they felt worse. They knew too much, they had seen what could happen without warning. And because danger was everywhere, trust eroded, not just trust in the environment, but in the senses themselves. Was that movement real? Was that sound close or far? Was the mind inventing threats or missing them? The pressure never lifted. Letters from home talked about normal life, cold drinks, quiet evenings, familiar streets. Reading them felt unreal, like glimpses into another person's memory. Vietnam did not feel connected to the rest of the world. It felt sealed off, self-contained, endless. Helicopters came and went, loud and violent, briefly tearing holes in the jungle canopy before disappearing again. They were reminders that escape existed, but not for you, not yet. Time was measured differently, not by dates, but by patrols survived. Some soldiers began counting days backward. Others stopped counting entirely. Focusing on the future made the present unbearable. Thinking too far ahead only magnified the fear of not making it there. Instead, attention narrowed. One step, one sound, one breath. The jungle forced that narrowing. It demanded complete mental occupation at all times. There was no space left for reflection, no room for processing what had already happened. Trauma did not arrive later. It accumulated silently, stacking moment by moment. Bodies stayed tense even when standing still. Muscles never fully relaxed. Jaws stayed clenched. Hands shook slightly, almost imperceptibly, until someone noticed and wondered how long it had been happening. Some soldiers described the sensation as being hunted without seeing the hunter. Others said it felt like the jungle itself was watching, waiting for a mistake. Mistakes were inevitable. Fatigue slowed reactions. Overthinking delayed decisions. Fear made judgment uneven. And the jungle punished hesitation mercilessly. Yet there were moments, brief, confusing moments, when the jungle almost felt peaceful. Sunlight filtering through leaves, a breeze cutting the heat for a second, the distant sound of water. Those moments were dangerous in their own way. They tempted the mind to loosen its grip. Veterans later said those were the moments they remembered most vividly, not because they were pleasant, but because they were rare. Relaxation felt like betrayal. The mind learned a new rule: if you feel safe, you probably aren't. And so the jungle trained American soldiers into a constant state of readiness, a psychological posture that did not turn off, that followed them even when they left the trees, even when the war ended. This raised a quiet question, one that many soldiers did not know how to ask at the time. What happens to a human mind when it is never allowed to stand down? The answer did not come in Vietnam. It followed them home. By the time most soldiers realized how deeply the jungle had changed them, it was already too late to undo. The body can survive almost anything if it knows when the danger will end. The jungle never provided that certainty. Patrols continued day after day, each one eroding something subtle. Not courage, not discipline. Something quieter, the ability to feel normal, the ability to trust silence, the ability to believe that nothing was about to happen. Men learned to read the jungle the way sailors read the sea, but the signs were never consistent. One day, birds going quiet meant nothing. The next day, it meant everything. Patterns formed and then broke without explanation. What saved a unit once could get them killed the next time. That uncertainty hollowed people out. Sweat-soaked uniforms stiffened with salt. Skin stayed permanently damp. Fungal infections spread. Feet softened inside boots, nails falling off, blisters reopening every morning. Pain became background noise. Complaining felt pointless. Everyone hurt. Everyone smelled the same. The jungle stripped individuality away. Names were used less. Ranks mattered less during long movements. What mattered was whether the man next to you noticed the same sound you did, whether he froze at the same moment, whether he saw the same flicker of movement between the trees. Trust narrowed to inches. Even then it was fragile. Because the jungle did not only hide the enemy, it distorted perception. Shadows stretched unnaturally at dusk. Fog rolled in without warning, swallowing visibility. Rain came hard and sudden, drumming so loudly on leaves that hearing anything else became impossible. During rain, fear intensified. The noise masked footsteps. The ground turned slick, slowing movement. Weapons needed constant attention. One malfunction could mean death. Fingers, numb from moisture and fatigue, fumbled with equipment that suddenly felt unfamiliar. And still the mind stayed alert, over-alert. The human brain was never designed for this level of sustained vigilance. Not for days. Not for weeks. Not for months. Yet Vietnam demanded it. Some soldiers began talking less. Conversation required energy. Humor dried up. Laughter felt risky, like tempting fate. Faces settled into expressions that barely changed, even when something startling happened. Emotional reactions flattened. Inside, though, nothing was calm. Every step forward carried imagined outcomes. Ambush. Explosion. Sniper fire. Booby traps that did not care how careful you were. Traps that waited patiently for pressure, for weight, for a single misstep. The jungle taught a brutal lesson. Skill did not guarantee survival. This realization gnawed at soldiers more than fear itself. Training promised control. Experience promised improvement. Vietnam quietly undermined both. You could do everything right and still not walk out. For some, this realization was worse than combat. It stripped meaning from effort. It made preparation feel hollow. It introduced a kind of helplessness that no amount of bravery could fix. In the middle of the war, many soldiers privately realized something uncomfortable. The moment that truly broke them was not combat, but the understanding that vigilance itself had become a trap they could never escape. They stayed alert because they had to, and they suffered because of it. Night amplified everything. Guard duty stretched endlessly. Darkness pressed in from all sides. The jungle breathed. Animals moved. Leaves shifted. The mind filled gaps instinctively. Shapes formed and dissolved. A rustle could be a rat or a man. Every possibility demanded the same response. Some soldiers fired at shadows. Others froze, unable to decide. Both outcomes carried consequences. Guilt followed either choice. The jungle did not forgive mistakes, but it also punished hesitation. Sleep deprivation worsened hallucinations. Peripheral vision played tricks. Familiar faces looked strange. Time lost coherence. Days felt detached from each other, as if memory itself were fragmenting. And yet, letters from home kept coming. News of birthdays missed. Children growing. Lives continuing somewhere else. Reading them created a strange ache, not just homesickness, but disbelief that such a world still existed. Vietnam felt permanent. Even moments of evacuation brought no relief. Helicopter rides lifted men above the canopy, offering brief glimpses of sunlight and distance. From above, the jungle looked calm, almost beautiful. That contrast disturbed many soldiers more than the fighting ever had. Beauty felt like deception. Back on the ground, the cycle resumed. Heat. Sweat. Listening. Waiting. The jungle resumed its pressure without acknowledgement. It did not care that you had been afraid yesterday. It did not care that you were tired today. Fear became normalized. Men stopped reacting to it as an emotion and started treating it as a condition. Like humidity. Like insects. Like pain in the joints. Always present. Always draining. Some soldiers later said they felt older than their age, by decades, not because of what they had seen, but because of what they had endured internally, minute by minute, without pause. The jungle forced an adaptation that worked in Vietnam and nowhere else. Constant scanning, hyper-awareness, emotional suppression, instant threat evaluation. These traits kept people alive. They also rewired the nervous system. The problem was that no one told them how to turn it off. As rotations ended and soldiers prepared to leave, many expected relief. They imagined release the way one imagines water after thirst. Instead, some felt something closer to emptiness or confusion, or a dull, lingering tension that refused to lift. The jungle had taught their minds a new baseline. Even away from it, the vigilance remained. Sounds startled them. Silence made them uneasy. Crowds felt unpredictable. Quiet rooms felt exposed. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and easily broken. The war did not end cleanly. It faded unevenly. And somewhere between the last patrol and the flight home, many soldiers realized that the jungle had not just surrounded them. It had followed them. The first sign that the jungle had not stayed behind came in moments that should have felt ordinary. A slammed door. A sudden shout. The snap of a branch underfoot in a quiet neighborhood. The body reacted before the mind could intervene. Muscles tightened. Breathing changed. Eyes searched for exits. Hands moved instinctively, then stopped, confused by their own urgency. There was no jungle here, no canopy, no ambush, and yet the reaction was real. Many veterans struggled to explain this to people who had never been there. They lacked language for it. Fear sounded too dramatic. Habit sounded too small. What lingered was something else entirely, a readiness that had no off switch. Vietnam had trained their nervous systems with ruthless consistency. In the jungle, alertness was survival. At home, it became a liability. Sleep remained elusive. Beds felt too soft, too exposed. Silence at night felt unnatural, broken only by distant sounds the brain could not place. Dreams returned soldiers to the same environments, repeating sensations, more than events, heat, pressure, waiting. Some woke, soaked in sweat, heart racing, unsure what had triggered it. Others avoided sleep entirely, preferring exhaustion to vulnerability. The jungle had taught them that unconsciousness was dangerous. Daytime offered no full escape. Crowded spaces overwhelmed the senses, too many movements, too many unknown variables. Even peaceful settings carried echoes of tension. A breeze through trees still raised hairs on the neck. Shadows still demanded attention. For many, the most unsettling realization was how automatic it all felt. There was no conscious decision to stay alert, no choice involved. The body remembered, even when the mind tried to move on. Families noticed changes before veterans did. Short tempers, emotional distance, startled reactions that seemed out of proportion. Attempts to explain often fell flat. How do you describe an environment where danger never announces itself? How do you explain that relaxation once meant death? Some veterans avoided forests entirely. Others sought them out, drawn back to the familiarity of discomfort. Neither response resolved the underlying tension. The jungle had imprinted itself not as a place, but as a condition. For a long time, there was little understanding of this. No language for hypervigilance. No framework for psychological wear caused by constant threat rather than singular trauma. Many veterans blamed themselves. They thought something was wrong with them personally. Their belief caused its own damage. One quiet truth began to emerge only years later. Vietnam had not just exposed soldiers to danger, it had required them to live inside it continuously. And the jungle was this perfect environment for that kind of psychological erosion. At some point during the war, survival stopped being about courage. It became about endurance, about staying functional long enough to make it out. And for many, that meant suppressing anything that slowed reaction time, including emotion. Some veterans later admitted that what scared them most was not the memory of firefights, but the realization that they no longer recognized what calm felt like. The jungle never let up, and neither did the adaptation it demanded. Even decades later, certain sensations triggered immediate responses. The smell of wet earth, the hum of insects at night, the weight of humidity pressing against skin. Memory lived in the senses, not in stories. Vietnam followed no neat narrative arc. There was no clear moment when fear began or ended. It crept in slowly and settled deeply. The jungle, in that sense, was not just a backdrop, it was an active force. Some veterans found ways to live with it. Structure helped. Routine. Control over environment. Others struggled, moving from job to job, relationship to relationship, always uneasy, always scanning. What united many of them was the same quiet recognition. They had learned how to survive in a world that never allowed relaxation, and then returned to one that expected it. That mismatch caused friction that never fully resolved. The jungle did not give them space to process loss or fear in the moment. It postponed everything. And when the war ended, all of it arrived at once without instruction or context. There was no ceremony for the end of vigilance. No signal that it was safe to stand down. And perhaps the most uncomfortable truth is this: the jungle did not break soldiers through constant violence. It changed them through constant anticipation, through the endless requirement to be ready, even when nothing happened. For many Americans, the Vietnam War is remembered through images of combat. But for those who lived inside the jungle, the defining memory was often quieter. It was the inability to ever fully relax, the sense that danger was always possible, always near, always invisible. That experience reshaped how they moved through the world long after the war was over. The jungle took nothing dramatic in a single moment. It took something slowly. It took the feeling of safety. And once taken, it was never easily returned. For a long time, many veterans tried to pretend that nothing had followed them home. They returned to jobs, to families, to routines that expected smooth transitions and quiet gratitude. On the surface, some succeeded. They showed up on time. They smiled when required. They avoided talking about the jungle because it felt unnecessary or impossible. But beneath that surface, the vigilance remained active. It showed up in small, ordinary moments, sitting in a restaurant and choosing a seat with a clear view of the entrance, noticing exits before menus, flinching at sudden laughter, feeling irritation rise for no clear reason when surrounded by too many people. The jungle had trained their attention to search for threats first and explanations later. Even moments meant for rest carried tension. Vacations felt disorienting. Leisure felt undeserved or unsafe. Quiet evenings stretched too long. Without something demanding focus, the mind filled the space on its own. And what it filled it with was rarely peaceful. Some veterans described a constant sense of waiting. Not for anything specific, just waiting. As if something were about to happen and they needed to be ready. That sensation had no object, no resolution. It simply lingered. In Vietnam, waiting had purpose. At home, it did not. The body still responded as if danger were imminent. Heart rate elevated without cause. Muscles tightened during calm conversations. Sleep came in short cycles, easily disrupted. Dreams replayed sensations rather than scenes, pressure, heat, listening. Many veterans woke with the same feeling they had in the jungle, alert before fully conscious. The day began already draining energy. Doctors struggled to explain it. Early labels focused on stress or adjustment issues. The deeper reality, that an environment had reshaped the nervous system through constant exposure, was poorly understood. The jungle had taught the brain to survive by never standing down. That lesson did not erase itself. For some, the strain turned inward. Withdrawal, emotional numbness, a sense of distance from others that felt protective but isolating. For others, it erupted outward, anger that surfaced quickly, frustration at small disruptions, a short fuse that surprised even the person experiencing it. Neither response was intentional. They were echoes. Relationships suffered quietly. Partners sensed a wall they could not see. Children noticed reactions that felt unpredictable. Veterans often felt guilt layered on top of confusion. They knew something was off, but not how to fix it. The jungle had never taught repair, only survival. In moments of honesty, some admitted that Vietnam felt more comprehensible than home. In the jungle, fear made sense. It had direction. It had rules, however inconsistent. At home, fear felt irrational, detached from reality. That disconnect made veterans doubt themselves. Some avoided situations that triggered the vigilance. Others confronted them repeatedly, hoping exposure would dull the response. Results varied. Time helped some. Others found that time merely spread the experience thinner without removing it. What remained consistent was the sense that something fundamental had shifted. The jungle had demanded a version of the self that was always alert, always prepared to react instantly. That version proved difficult to retire. Years later, as research began to catch up, a clearer picture formed. Trauma did not always come from a single catastrophic event. It could emerge from constant, low-level threat without recovery, from environments that never allowed the nervous system to reset. Vietnam's jungle was exactly that environment. There were no safe hours, no guaranteed pauses, no spaces where vigilance could fully drop. Even moments of beauty carried risk. Even stillness felt suspicious. The cost of that adaptation was invisible at first. It became visible only later, in everyday life. Some veterans found meaning in sharing these experiences. Others preferred silence. Both choices were understandable. Language often failed to capture what the jungle had done. Words like fear and stress felt inadequate. What lingered was something closer to conditioning. The jungle conditioned attention, perception, and response. It rewired how danger was detected and how safety was defined, or rather, how safety was no longer assumed. That shift affected how veterans experienced the world long after the war faded from headlines. For many Americans, the Vietnam War ended in 1975. For those shaped by the jungle, it ended unevenly, if at all. And perhaps the most difficult part was explaining that nothing dramatic needed to happen for damage to occur. That constant anticipation alone was enough. That the absence of rest could be as harmful as violence. This understanding challenges a comfortable narrative. It suggests that survival is not always a clean victory. That coming home does not always mean returning unchanged. The jungle did not follow veterans as memories alone. It followed them as reflexes, as instincts, as patterns written into the body. In quiet moments, when there was nothing to do and nowhere to be, some veterans noticed how uncomfortable stillness felt. How the mind searched for tasks, for focus, for something to monitor. Peace felt unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things felt dangerous. This realization often arrived slowly, sometimes decades later. It carried sadness, but also clarity. The problem was not personal weakness. It was adaptation taken too far to be easily undone. The jungle had never let them relax, and it had taught them not to expect relaxation again. Understanding that truth did not erase the effects, but for some, it eased the blame. It reframed their experience as a human response to an inhuman level of sustained pressure. Vietnam's jungle was not remembered only for what happened there. It was remembered for what it demanded. Constant awareness, constant readiness, constant restraint. And once learned, those demands proved difficult to leave behind. As the years passed, memory softened some details, but sharpened others. Faces blurred. Dates slipped away. Specific locations lost their names. But the feeling remained precise. Veterans could forget the exact path of a patrol and still remember exactly how it felt to move through the jungle with every sense stretched thin. They could forget who walked beside them and still remember the weight in their chest when the jungle went quiet all at once. That quiet never stopped meaning danger. For many, the most persistent legacy was not fear itself, but anticipation. A low, constant readiness that shaped decisions without announcing itself. It influenced where they sat, how they slept, how they reacted to uncertainty. It made spontaneity difficult. It made trust slow. The jungle had taught them that unpredictability was lethal. In Vietnam, that lesson saved lives. At home, it complicated living. Some veterans gravitated toward professions that mirrored the structure they had lost, jobs with clear rules, clear chains of command, predictable routines. Others avoided structure entirely, rejecting anything that felt like enforced vigilance. Both paths reflected the same underlying tension. They were still negotiating with an environment that no longer existed. The body did not understand that. Neuroscience would eventually explain what many veterans already knew intuitively. The nervous system adapts to repeated threat by recalibrating what normal feels like. When danger is constant, calm becomes unfamiliar. When vigilance is required for survival, relaxation feels unsafe. Vietnam's jungle was an extreme training ground for that adaptation. There was no decompression period, no gradual return to baseline. Soldiers went from total immersion in threat to ordinary civilian life in a matter of days. The mind struggled to keep up. Some veterans described the sensation as being dropped into a different world without instructions, a world where their most reliable instincts suddenly seemed inappropriate, even alarming. And yet, those instincts did not fade simply because they were inconvenient. In moments of crisis, they often returned with clarity and speed. Veterans reacted decisively. They noticed details others missed. They stayed calm under pressure. These traits were praised, even admired, but the cost remained. Being ready all the time is exhausting. Being unable to relax drains joy from ordinary moments. Many veterans found that happiness felt muted, not absent muted. As if emotional volume had been turned down to preserve energy. Laughter happened, but cautiously. Excitement rose, then quickly leveled off. The jungle had rewarded emotional control. It punished distraction. Those lessons endured. Some veterans spoke about guilt, not survivor's guilt alone, but a subtler form. Guilt for not feeling the way they thought they should. Guilt for feeling detached during moments that mattered to others. Guilt for missing the clarity of a place that had nearly destroyed them. That contradiction was hard to reconcile. Vietnam's jungle was brutal, unforgiving, and terrifying. It was also simple in one crucial way. Everything revolved around staying alive. Purpose was immediate. Attention was focused. There was no ambiguity about what mattered in the moment. Civilian life offered none of that clarity. Bills, conversations, long-term plans all required a different kind of engagement, a slower, less urgent one. For minds shaped by constant threat, that pace felt unnatural. Some veterans learned to slow down deliberately. Therapy helped some. Community helped others. Time helped many. But even those who adjusted well often admitted that something fundamental never fully returned. They learned to live with it rather than erase it. The jungle's influence faded unevenly. Loud reactions softened. Sleep improved. Crowds became manageable. But the underlying awareness often remained, like a background process that never fully shut off. And perhaps that is the quiet truth at the center of this story. The jungle did not destroy most soldiers outright. It reshaped them gradually. It asked for total attention day after day without offering relief. It demanded that the mind stay open and alert and guarded at all times. That demand left marks that were invisible to those who had not lived inside it. When Americans talk about Vietnam, they often focus on battles, politics, or controversy. Those narratives miss something essential. They overlook the daily psychological grind, the slow erosion caused not by constant fighting, but by constant readiness. For the men who walked through that jungle, the defining experience was not always what they did. It was how long they had to stay ready to do it. Even now, decades later, some veterans notice it in themselves during quiet moments. Sitting alone, listening to the world, feeling the old urge to scan, to prepare, to anticipate, recognizing it for what it is. A habit formed under pressure. The jungle never announced when it was finished teaching that lesson. It simply stopped being there. Everything else had to be relearned. With distance, some veterans began to see the jungle more clearly, not as a place, but as a system. A system that applied pressure constantly and without explanation. A system that rewarded awareness and punished relaxation. A system that never clarified when the danger was over. Seen this way, the jungle functioned less like terrain and more like an environment designed to keep the human mind permanently off balance. There was no winning against it, only enduring it. In interviews years later, many veterans struggled when asked what the hardest part of Vietnam had been. They often paused. They searched for words. Some mentioned firefights. Others mentioned losing friends. But many eventually circled back to something quieter, the waiting, the listening, the never knowing. That uncertainty followed them long after they left Southeast Asia. It shaped how they handled risk, how they processed stress, how they reacted to sudden change. Some became hyper-prepared for everything, backup plans for backup plans. Others rejected planning altogether, living moment to moment, avoiding the anxiety that came with imagining the future. Both responses reflected the same lesson learned in the jungle: control is fragile. The jungle had taught them that certainty was an illusion. This lesson ran deep. It influenced how veterans raised children. Some became intensely protective. Others encouraged independence early, knowing that danger could not be eliminated, only navigated. Their experiences informed choices they could not always articulate. And still, many avoided talking about the jungle itself. Describing combat was easier. Combat had a shape, a beginning, and an end. The jungle was harder to explain because it never resolved. It pressed in slowly, persistently, without offering a clear narrative. It was always there. Over time, silence around these experiences created distance. Veterans learned that most people wanted dramatic stories or simple conclusions. The truth that the most damaging part was ongoing tension without release felt unsatisfying to listeners. So it remained unspoken. The jungle became something they carried privately. As understanding of psychological trauma evolved, some veterans finally found language that fit. Terms like hypervigilance, chronic stress response, and nervous system dysregulation provided validation. They explained reactions that had once felt like personal failures. But explanation did not equal erasure. The jungle's influence lived in the body, in posture, in breathing, in attention patterns shaped long ago. It surfaced during illness, fatigue, or stress when the mind reverted to older settings. Those moments reminded veterans that adaptation leaves traces. In a strange way, the jungle never fully left because it never fully ended. There was no clear moment when vigilance was no longer necessary. No signal that safety had returned permanently. And without that signal, the body stayed ready. This reality complicates how we think about war. It suggests that damage is not always immediate or visible. That environments themselves can wound even when nothing dramatic happens. Vietnam's jungle did exactly that. It forced soldiers into a state of constant readiness and then released them back into a world that did not require it. The transition was abrupt. The consequences were long-lasting. For some, meaning eventually emerged from this experience. They recognized resilience in themselves. They found purpose in helping others understand unseen wounds. They reframed survival as something complex and costly rather than purely heroic. For others, the jungle remained an unresolved presence, a reference point they rarely visited, consciously, but always carried. Neither outcome was wrong. The jungle had not offered choices. It had imposed conditions. And under those conditions, human minds did what they always do. They adapt. Perhaps the most important thing to understand is this: the jungle did not need to act aggressively to be destructive. It simply needed to never allow rest, to never allow certainty, to never allow the mind to disengage from threat. That was enough. In that sense, the jungle became one of the most effective psychological forces American soldiers ever faced. Not because it was alive, but because it created an environment where fear could never fully resolve. Fear, without resolution, does not fade. It reorganizes. As veterans aged, some found a measure of peace in recognizing this, in understanding that what followed them home was not weakness, but conditioning. Not failure, but consequence. The jungle had asked everything of their attention, and it had taken its payment quietly. In moments of reflection, some veterans acknowledged a difficult truth. The jungle did not just test them during the war. It continued to test them afterward, in how they learned to live with its imprint. That test never had a clear finish line. And maybe that is why the jungle still matters, not as a setting in history books, but as a reminder of what constant psychological pressure can do to ordinary people placed in extraordinary conditions. It shows us that war does not always end when soldiers leave the battlefield. Sometimes it ends unevenly. Sometimes it ends only partially. Sometimes it never fully ends at all. In later years, as the veterans aged and the noise of everyday life softened, the jungle sometimes returned in quieter ways. Not as fear, not as panic, but as awareness, a heightened sensitivity to environments, a habit of reading rooms, an instinct to measure risk before comfort. These traits no longer felt dramatic. They felt embedded, part of how the world was processed. Some veterans described it as living with a second set of senses, always running in the background. The jungle had trained the mind to look for what did not fit. For some, this became a strange kind of strength. They navigated crises with calm efficiency. They stayed composed when others panicked. They made decisions under pressure with clarity born from experience. But strength and cost were inseparable. That same vigilance made rest complicated. It made uncertainty uncomfortable. It made the idea of complete safety feel theoretical rather than real. Even in peaceful moments, part of the mind remained engaged, monitoring. The jungle had not taught them how to stop looking. As society slowly changed how it talked about war, a new generation listened differently. Veterans found that younger audiences were more willing to hear about psychological weight rather than battlefield heroics. They listened when veterans spoke about exhaustion instead of bravery. That shift mattered. It allowed some veterans to finally describe what had been missing from earlier conversations. Not explosions, not chaos, but the long stretch of time spent under invisible pressure. The feeling of being watched by an environment that never revealed its intentions. They spoke about how the jungle made them suspicious of calm, how stillness felt earned only temporarily, how peace, when it appeared, felt fragile. These were not dramatic revelations. They were quiet acknowledgments. In telling these stories, some veterans noticed something unexpected. The jungle lost a bit of its power when it was named clearly, when it was described not as a mysterious force, but as sustained psychological stress. Language did not erase the past, but it softened its edges. Still, many veterans never spoke publicly. Their experiences remained internal, shaped by years of private negotiation. They lived functional lives. They contributed, they adapted, and they carried the imprint without complaint. That silence should not be mistaken for absence. The jungle had done its work regardless of whether it was discussed. One of the most persistent misunderstandings about Vietnam is the belief that soldiers were most affected by moments of extreme violence. In reality, many veterans later acknowledged that the deepest changes came from something less visible, the requirement to stay ready indefinitely without knowing when that requirement would end. The jungle never forced a breaking point all at once. It wore people down slowly. And because the damage was gradual, it was easy to overlook. As time moved forward, some veterans reached a place of acceptance. Not peace, exactly, but understanding. They recognized that the version of themselves shaped by the jungle was not something to defeat. It was something to integrate. They learned when to trust it and when to gently ignore it. That balance took years, sometimes decades. What remained was perspective. They knew more than most how fragile normalcy can be, how thin the line is between calm and chaos, how quickly the human mind adapts to pressure, and how difficult it is to reverse that adaptation. The jungle had been an extreme teacher, but its lesson applied far beyond Vietnam. It showed what happens when people are denied recovery. When vigilance becomes permanent, when the nervous system is asked to perform beyond its natural limits for too long. In that sense, the jungle was not unique to Vietnam. But Vietnam made it unavoidable. For American soldiers, it was the environment that never let them relax. And that fact shaped everything that came after. In the end, what the jungle left behind was not a single memory, but a way of existing. A posture toward the world. A readiness that no longer needed justification. For many veterans, this realization arrived quietly. There was no moment of revelation, no clear line between before and after. Just a gradual understanding that the person who entered the jungle and the person who returned were not the same and never would be. That difference was not always visible. It did not announce itself. It lived beneath the surface, influencing reactions before thoughts could form. The jungle had taught them that danger does not ask permission, that safety is temporary, that awareness is a form of armor. Those lessons were learned deeply. In peaceful moments, when the world slowed down, veterans sometimes noticed how difficult it was to fully settle into stillness. Not because of fear, but because stillness itself felt incomplete. As if something were missing. As if the mind expected another signal that never came. In Vietnam, that signal was survival. At home, there was no equivalent. Some veterans eventually found ways to create it. Through routine, through service, through work that demanded focus and presence. Others found it through connection, shared understanding with those who had lived similar experiences. And some never found it at all. What united them was not trauma in the dramatic sense, but conditioning. The jungle had conditioned their minds to function under constant uncertainty. It had removed the assumption that calm was normal. This truth challenges how wars are remembered. It suggests that the most lasting damage does not always come from the loudest moments. It comes from environments that never allow recovery. From places where the nervous system is pushed beyond its limits, not once but continuously. Vietnam's jungle was such a place. It did not need to act. It only needed to persist. For American soldiers, there was no off-duty version of themselves inside it. No mental space where they could fully disengage. Every moment required attention. Every pause carried risk. That experience reshaped how safety was understood. Years later, when veterans spoke about Vietnam, many avoided dramatic language. They did not talk about terror. They talked about tiredness, about how exhausting it was to be alert all the time, about how draining it felt to never be certain. Those descriptions often surprised listeners. They sounded almost understated. But that understatement carried weight. It pointed to a difficult truth. Endurance itself can be traumatic when it is demanded without relief. The jungle never let soldiers relax. And in doing so, it rewired how relaxation felt. That rewiring followed them home. It influenced how they loved, how they rested, how they trusted, how they imagined the future. It shaped choices they did not always recognize as connected to the past. And yet, within that imprint, there was also resilience. Surviving such an environment required adaptability, awareness, and restraint. Those qualities did not disappear. They became part of who these veterans were. Sometimes burdensome, sometimes useful, always present. The jungle had taken something, but it had also revealed something about the human mind, its capacity to endure, to adjust, and to carry forward even when changed. That duality resists simple conclusions. It resists narratives of victory or defeat. It asks instead for recognition of complexity. Vietnam was not just a war fought against an enemy. For many soldiers, it was a prolonged negotiation with an environment that never allowed them to feel safe. The jungle did not need to be remembered as an adversary to be understood as a force. It shaped behavior. It shaped perception. It shaped lives. And long after the war faded into history, that shaping remained. In understanding this, we move closer to the reality of what Vietnam did to those who lived inside it. Not through spectacle, but through pressure. Not through moments, but through duration. The jungle that never let you.
Yes.
Soldiers relax did not disappear when they left Vietnam. It lived on in instincts, in habits, in quiet moments of awareness that never fully went away. That is its legacy.